June 18th, 1815, a Sunday that would change European history forever. On the muddy fields of Belgium, near a small village called Waterloo, three armies got ready for what would be called the most important battle of the 1800s. On one side was the man who had taken over almost all of Europe, who had made kings and emperors shake with fear because of his brilliant military skills. On the other side was a group of countries determined to stop his rule once and for all. But what really decided this battle was not just the bravery of the soldiers or the plans of the generals. It was a secret weapon, a new way of fighting that Napoleon Bonaparte completely underestimated, and which would end up destroying not only his army, but his entire empire. This is the story of the Battle of Waterloo, but it's not the story you know. We won't just talk about horse soldiers charging or foot soldiers in rows. We'll show you the secret that changed the battlefield, the invisible weapon hiding in plain sight, which even the greatest military genius of his time failed to understand until it was too late. Get ready to discover how the greatest military victory against Napoleon was won not just with gunpowder and steel, but with something far more powerful and new. Before we begin this amazing journey through one of the bloodiest days in European history, join our community, subscribe, and leave a comment with the time you watch this video. Let's find out where our viewers are following us on this historic journey from. To understand what really happened at Waterloo, we need to go back in time, not just a few months or years, but many years. We need to understand who Napoleon Bonaparte was and how he got to that battlefield in June 1815. Born in Corsica in 1769, Napoleon was a young officer who fired cannons when the French Revolution started in 1789. He grew up during the chaos, violence, and big changes that transformed France from a country ruled by a king to a country ruled by the people. It was a time when anything seemed possible, when talented men could rise quickly, no matter where they were born. Napoleon was not born into a noble family in the traditional French way. His family was minor nobility from Corsica, which meant he was in a unique position, not fully part of the rich families, but not completely outside them either. He went to French military schools where he showed amazing talent for math, and especially for the science of using cannons. While other young officers saw cannons just as tools for destruction, Napoleon understood cannons as an exact science, a form of military art that combined physics, math, and understanding how people think. His rise was incredibly fast. In 1793, when he was just 24 years old, he played an important role in the siege of Toulon, where his cannon tactics helped drive British and Royalist forces from the port city. He was promoted to brigadier general. In 1796, at age 26, he was given command of the Army of Italy, where he led a brilliant campaign against the Austrians, defeating much larger forces through quick movement, better supplies, and smart use of his forces. What made Napoleon different from other generals of his time was his approach to war. While most European commanders still fought in the traditional 1700s way of carefully planned battles and avoiding risks, Napoleon embraced speed, boldness, and the complete destruction of enemy forces. He didn't just want to win battles. He wanted to completely destroy enemy armies, making it impossible for them to keep fighting. His campaigns in Italy, Egypt, and later throughout Europe showed military brilliance not seen since the days of Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France. He was not crowned by a pope or another king. He placed the crown on his own head, a symbolic gesture that told the world his power came from himself, from his own victories, not from God or family bloodlines. In the years that followed, he remade the map of Europe. He defeated the Austrians at Austerlitz, the Prussians at Jena, the Russians at Friedland. He placed his brothers on thrones throughout Europe, dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, and made Paris the center of the civilized world. But every empire has its cracks. The campaign in Spain, which began in 1808, turned into a bloody nightmare. The Spanish refused to accept French rule and fought a brutal guerrilla war that drained French resources for years. Supply lines were stretched too far. French soldiers, used to living off the conquered land, met hostile populations who would rather burn their own crops than feed the invaders. It was in Spain that the French army, previously thought to be unbeatable, began to look beatable. Then came the Russian disaster of 1812. Napoleon invaded Russia with a Grande Armée, over 600,000 men strong, the largest military force put together up to that point in European history. He expected a quick, decisive battle like his previous victories. But the Russians retreated, burning everything in their path, denying Napoleon the battle he so desperately wanted. When a major fight finally happened at Borodino, it was a horrible slaughter, with both sides suffering devastating losses. Napoleon arrived in Moscow to find the city in flames, burned by the Russians themselves. The retreat from Russia in the brutal winter of 1812 was like the end of the world. Of 600,000 men, fewer than 100,000 returned. Those who survived were broken, sick, and traumatized. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was shattered. France's allies smelled blood in the water. Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Sweden all turned against him. Even his own marshals began to doubt. The German campaign of 1813 was a desperate struggle. Napoleon showed flashes of his former brilliance, but he was fighting against overwhelming forces. At the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of the Nations, he faced a coalition of Allied armies and was decisively defeated. Paris was invaded in 1814. Napoleon was forced to give up his throne and was exiled to the island of Elba, a small island in the Mediterranean. Europe breathed a sigh of relief. The victors gathered at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the map of Europe, to restore the old monarchies and create a balance of power that would prevent any one nation from dominating again. Louis XIV, brother of the king executed during the Revolution, was restored to the French throne. It seemed the era of Napoleon was over. It seemed Europe would finally have peace. But Napoleon was not a man to accept defeat easily. On Elba, he ruled his small island and watched. He watched France under the restored Bourbons. He watched how the veterans who had followed him across Europe were pushed aside. He watched how the old nobility tried to reverse the reforms that the Revolution and his own government had made, and he saw an opportunity. In February 1815, with incredible daring, Napoleon escaped from Elba with a small force of about 1,000 men and landed on mainland France. What happened next was almost miraculous. The Bourbon government sent troops to capture him, but when those troops found Napoleon, they joined him. As he approached Paris, entire regiments left the Royal Guard to march under his banners again. In 20 days, without firing a single shot, Napoleon reconquered France. Louis XVIII fled to Belgium. The Emperor was back. This period would become known as the 100 Days, but Napoleon knew his return was shaky. The European powers would never accept him back. Great Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia immediately declared war. Huge armies began gathering to crush France once more. Napoleon had a narrow window of opportunity. If he waited for all these armies to gather, he would be fighting impossible odds. His only chance was to strike quickly, defeat the coalition armies one by one before they could combine, and force the Allies to negotiate peace from a position of strength. The closest armies were those of the Duke of Wellington, commanding an Anglo-Allied force in Belgium, and Marshal Blucher, commanding the Prussian army. These two armies were not completely united. There was distance between them. If Napoleon could reach them quickly, he could place his army between them, defeating one and then the other. It was risky, but it was his style: boldness, speed, destroying the enemy in detail. It was how he had conquered Europe, and it was how he would try to save it once again. In June 1815, Napoleon marched north with about 125,000 men. They crossed into Belgium and caught Wellington and Blucher by surprise. Napoleon managed to place his army between the Allied forces exactly as planned. On June 16th, he divided his forces. He sent Marshal Ney to hold Wellington at Quatre Bras, while he himself attacked the Prussians at Ligny. The Battle of Ligny was a French victory. The Prussians were badly beaten and retreated. Napoleon believed he had knocked them out of the war, that they would withdraw east to regroup, leaving Wellington isolated and vulnerable. But Napoleon made a critical error. He sent over 30,000 men under Marshal Grouchy to pursue the Prussians and ensure they caused no further trouble. This significantly weakened his main force, and the Prussians under Blücher did not retreat eastward as Napoleon had hoped. They retreated northward, maintaining contact with Wellington and preserving the possibility of rejoining the Anglo-Allied army. It was a brilliant strategic move by Blücher, an old Prussian general who hated Napoleon with a passion and was determined to see him destroyed at any cost. Wellington, realizing that the Prussians could still support him, decided to stop and fight. He chose a strong defensive position south of the village of Waterloo, along a low ridge that offered a good defensive position. The position was excellent. The ridge would allow him to hide most of his troops from French view and artillery fire. There were good retreat routes if things went wrong. Most importantly, if Blücher could arrive in time, the two armies could crush Napoleon between them. Wellington had about 68,000 men, a multinational force of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops of varying quality. Many were inexperienced troops. His best regiments, the veterans who had fought in the Iberian Peninsula against the French, were there, but there were also many untested units. Napoleon arrived at Wellington's position on the evening of June 17th. It had rained heavily, turning the field into mud. Napoleon decided to wait until morning to attack, allowing the ground to dry out slightly so his artillery and cavalry could move properly. It was another decision that would be questioned later. Every hour of delay gave the Prussians more time to arrive, but Napoleon didn't believe Blücher could arrive in time, or even that he would try. He completely underestimated the old Prussians' determination. On the morning of June 18th, the two armies prepared for battle. Napoleon had about 72,000 men available, slightly more than Wellington, and a big advantage in artillery. He had about 250 artillery pieces to Wellington's only about 150. The French soldiers were experienced veterans, many of whom had marched with Napoleon across Europe. They believed in their emperor almost like a religion. They had seen his miracles on the battlefield before and believed they would see another that day. Napoleon's plan was relatively simple. He would launch a massive artillery bombardment to weaken Wellington's center, then send his brother Jerome to attack Wellington's right flank at Hougoumont, a large fortified farmstead. This flank attack would draw out Wellington's reserves. Then Napoleon would launch the main thrust, a massive infantry column that would advance through the center of Wellington's position and break his line. The cavalry would exploit the breach, and Wellington's army would be destroyed. It was the kind of battle Napoleon had fought and won dozens of times, but there was one problem Napoleon didn't fully understand. There was something different about this army he faced. Something in the way Wellington had structured his defense, something in the weaponry and tactics the British would use. This was the secret weapon that would destroy his hopes. And it wasn't a new type of cannon or a revolutionary technological invention. It was something more subtle, more integrated into the very structure of Wellington's army. It was the way the British trained, equipped, and commanded their infantry. Let's understand what made the British infantry so different. In European armies of the time, including the French, muskets were notoriously inaccurate weapons. Most armies trained their soldiers to fire in large groups in a line, creating a wall of lead that had a chance of hitting the enemy through sheer volume of fire. The French musket, the Charleville, was a reliable weapon. But like all flintlock muskets of the time, it was inaccurate beyond about 50 meters and had a slow rate of fire. It takes about 30 seconds for a trained soldier to load and fire a flintlock musket. The British used the Brown Bess musket, which was not technically superior to the Charleville. In fact, in many ways it was similar. The difference was not in the weapon itself, but in the way the British trained their soldiers to use it. The British Army had a culture of fierce discipline and intensive shooting practice. British soldiers practiced shooting constantly, far more than their counterparts in other armies. While most European armies considered ammunition too expensive for extensive practice, the British understood that well-trained soldiers won battles. But the real British innovation wasn't just better shooting. It was how they formed their lines and delivered their fire. While most European armies formed in deep columns for the attack, which provided mass and momentum but meant only the soldiers at the front could fire, the British developed the two-line formation. This formation, a line just 2 ranks deep, was revolutionary. It meant almost all soldiers could fire at once, maximizing firepower, and the British trained to deliver devastating volleys at close range, waiting until the enemy was very close before firing. The discipline required for this tactic was extraordinary. It required nerves of steel to stand still in a thin line while enemy columns marched toward you, shouting, drums beating, bayonets gleaming. It required intensive training not to fire too soon, to wait for the command, to deliver controlled and coordinated fire. But when done correctly, the results were devastating. An attacking column, tightly packed with only the soldiers at the front able to use their weapons, would be hit by a wall of fire from hundreds of muskets simultaneously at ranges where even inaccurate weapons could not miss. Wellington understood the power of this tactic perfectly. He had perfected it on the Iberian Peninsula, fighting the French for years in Spain and Portugal. He had repeatedly used the thin line formation against French columns and repeatedly destroyed French attacks with devastating volleys, followed by bayonet charges. French veterans who had fought on the peninsula knew and feared the British Red Line, but many in Napoleon's army at Waterloo had no such experience, and Napoleon himself, who had not been personally involved in the peninsula struggle, seemed not to fully understand how effective this tactic was. There was more to the British system. Wellington also used the terrain brilliantly. He positioned his troops just behind ridges or on reverse slopes where they were invisible and protected from artillery fire until the critical moment. Then, as the French approached, expecting to find a line weakened by bombardment, they would discover fresh, intact troops emerging from the reverse slope position, delivering deadly volleys at close range. It was a trick he had used repeatedly in Spain, but it still caught French commanders by surprise. Then there were the rifles. While most British infantry used standard smoothbore muskets, the British also had regiments equipped with Baker rifles. These rifles had rifled barrels that spun the ball, giving them much greater accuracy. A trained marksman with a Baker rifle could hit targets at 200 or even 300 meters, far beyond the effective range of a musket. British riflemen, organized into light infantry units, were used to harass the French, picking off officers and artillerymen, disrupting formations, and creating chaos. These were guerrilla tactics integrated into a regular army. This combination, the thin line with its tremendous firepower, the clever use of terrain, the harassing and disruptive riflemen, and above all, the iron discipline that kept the soldiers in their positions under the worst imaginable fire. This was the system that had repeatedly defeated the French in Spain, and it was the system Wellington had brought to Waterloo. This was the secret weapon, not a single technology, but an integrated system of tactics, training, and leadership that transformed ordinary soldiers into a terrifyingly efficient fighting machine. Napoleon used defeating Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies with his massive attack columns supported by heavy artillery, failed to adjust his tactics appropriately to what he faced. He saw a smaller army occupying a position, and he believed that, as so often before, a heavy bombardment followed by column attacks would crush enemy resistance. He had won Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram with these tactics. Why wouldn't they work again? This over-reliance on tried-and-true methods, this failure to adapt to a different enemy with different capabilities, would be fatal. The battle began around 11 on the morning of June 18th. The initial attack was against Hougoumont, a large fortified farmstead on Wellington's right flank. Napoleon ordered his younger brother Jerome to take the position. The attack on Hougoumont, intended as a secondary diversion, turned into a day-long massacre. The British and Hanoverian defenders turned the buildings into fortresses. The French launched attack after attack, setting buildings ablaze, fighting room to room. Thousands of men were tied up in this struggle for a piece of land that had no real strategic value. It was supposed to draw Wellington's reserves, but it ended up drawing ever more French troops as well. The attack on Hougoumont was a perfect example of a tactic tying up far more resources than its success or failure was worth. As the fighting at Hougoumont continued, Napoleon began his main artillery bombardment against the center of Wellington's position. More than 80 guns opened fire, raining round shot and shrapnel onto the ridge where Wellington's troops were positioned. It was meant to be a devastating prelude, weakening and demoralizing the defenders before the main infantry attack. But its effectiveness was limited. Wellington had positioned most of his troops on the reverse slope, protected from direct line of sight. The cannonballs striking the wet ground tended to sink in, rather than bounce and cause massive casualties as they would on hard, dry ground. The bombardment certainly caused casualties and was terrifying for the troops on the receiving end, but it did not break Wellington's formation. Around 1 p.m., Napoleon ordered the first major infantry attack. Count d'Erlon would lead 4 divisions, some 16,000 men, in a massive assault against Wellington's center left. The French troops advanced in enormous columns, each division forming a massive column of battalions. It was an impressive sight, thousands of men marching in perfect formation to the beat of drums, flags waving, shouting their cheers for the emperor. The earth shook beneath their feet. It seemed unstoppable, a force of nature that would sweep away any opposition. But when the French columns reached the top of the ridge, they discovered that Wellington's troops had not been destroyed by the bombardment. As they climbed the slope, exhausted from the climb in full gear, crossing soft, wet ground, they were met by something unexpected. The British lines, which had been lying down or sheltering behind the ridge, suddenly rose, and then came the fire, volley after volley of musketry, delivered with mechanical precision. The fronts of the French columns were cut down. Men fell in large numbers. The columns faltered. The physics of the situation favored the British terribly. A column, perhaps 60 men wide but many ranks deep, presented a compact target where almost every shot would hit someone. But only the men in the first few ranks could return fire. The British line, perhaps 2 ranks deep but stretching hundreds of meters, could bring hundreds of muskets to bear simultaneously. It was a matter of deadly mathematics. For every Frenchman who could fire, there were multiple British firing back. And the British, trained to deliver controlled and disciplined fire, were devastatingly effective at close range. The French columns tried to deploy in line to return fire properly, but this takes time and space, and under heavy fire, it was nearly impossible. Officers fell. The ranks fell apart. The momentum of the attack was lost. And then Wellington ordered his heavy cavalry, the Union Brigade under the Earl of Uxbridge, to attack. Scots Greys, King's Dragoon Guards, and Inniskillings, nearly 2,000 heavy horsemen on massive horses, charged across the crest and fell upon the disorganized French. The impact was catastrophic. The French infantry columns, already shattered by musket fire, crumbled under the cavalry charge. Thousands of French soldiers were killed, captured, or fled in panic. The British cavalry, drunk on success, continued advancing. They swept through the French artillery batteries, cutting down the gunners and making the cannons useless. They captured 2 French imperial eagles, the sacred standards of the regiments that Napoleon had personally given. It was a spectacular triumph. But then the British cavalry made a fatal mistake. They pushed too far. Exhausted, disorganized, deep within the French lines, they were counterattacked by fresh French cavalry, the Lancers and Cuirassiers. The British cavalry, their horses exhausted, their formations broken, were massacred. The Union Brigade was virtually destroyed as a fighting force. Of 2,000 cavalry, only a few hundred returned. It was a tragic display of courage, exceeding judgment. Napoleon had been dealt a heavy blow. His main infantry attack had failed with heavy losses, but he was not one to give up easily. And then he received disturbing news. The Prussians were approaching. Scouts reported Prussian columns approaching from the east. Blücher, wounded at Ligny just 2 days earlier, was riding with his army to join Wellington. Napoleon was now in a race against time. He needed to destroy Wellington before the Prussians arrived in force. But something strange was about to happen. Marshal Ney, commanding under Napoleon and known for his insane bravery that earned him the nickname the bravest of the brave, observed what he interpreted as Wellington withdrawing troops from his position. In reality, Wellington was merely repositioning units and moving wounded, but from a distance, with gunpowder smoke obscuring the view, it appeared to Ney that the British were retreating. Seeing an opportunity, Ney made a decision of his own that would become one of the most controversial in military history. He ordered a massive cavalry charge against the center of the British lines. Ney assembled all available French cavalry, some 5,000 horsemen, the finest cavalry in France, cuirassiers in their gleaming armor, dragoons, lancers, hussars. It was the largest cavalry force assembled in a single area since the Crusades. They formed in successive waves, and around 3:30 in the afternoon, they began their attack. It was a glorious and terrifying sight. Thousands of horsemen thundering down the hillside, the ground shaking, sabers and lances raised, shouting for their country and their emperor. But Wellington was ready. His infantry brigades quickly formed squares, the standard defensive formation against cavalry. An infantry square, 4 sides of soldiers with bayonets pointing outward like a giant hedgehog, was extremely difficult for cavalry to break. Horses wouldn't charge into a wall of bayonets, and from within the squares, soldiers could fire in all directions at the circling, frustrated cavalry. The French cavalry attacked repeatedly. Wave after wave swept through the British positions. For more than 2 hours they attacked, but the squares held firm. British discipline once again proved the decisive weapon. Under constant musket and artillery fire, suffering horrific losses, the British soldiers maintained their formations. When gaps appeared where men fell, they were quickly filled. Officers walked calmly between the ranks, encouraging, threatening, maintaining order. Sergeants kept the men in line, and the fire continued, cutting down French cavalrymen and horses. British artillery played a crucial role. As the French cavalry approached, the gunners fired canister shot, essentially turning their cannons into giant shotguns, unleashing hundreds of musket balls in a single blast. When the cavalry got too close, the gunners ran to the safety of the nearest infantry squares, temporarily abandoning their cannons. As soon as the cavalry passed, frustrated at their inability to break through, the gunners ran back to their pieces and resumed the slaughter. The French cavalry was being destroyed. Cavalry and horses fell by the thousands. The hillside was covered with dead and wounded, men and animals dying together. But Ney kept sending more cavalry. It was foolishness, a huge waste of some of France's finest troops. Napoleon, watching from a distance, was furious when he realized what Ney was doing. Cavalry alone could never break infantry drawn up in squares. They needed infantry support to break the formations, and then the cavalry could exploit the breach. But Ney, in the heat of battle, obsessed with victory, kept feeding cavalry to the slaughter. Meanwhile, on the French right flank, the Prussians were closing in. The first units of Blücher's 4th Corps, under Bülow's command, began attacking the village of Plancenoit in the French rear. Napoleon was forced to divert precious troops to counter this new threat. He sent the young guard, some of his best soldiers, to Plancenoit. A fierce battle erupted in the village, fighting house by house, street by street. The French initially drove the Prussians back, but more Prussians continued to arrive. Blücher was throwing every available man into the battle, determined to keep his promise to Wellington no matter the cost. Napoleon's situation was getting worse rapidly. He had lost his initial infantry attack. The cavalry was being slaughtered in useless attacks. The Prussians were pressing his flank and rear. Time was running out. He needed a decisive blow, something that would break Wellington once and for all, before more Prussians arrived and the situation became hopeless. He had one last card to play: the Imperial Guard. The Imperial Guard was the absolute elite of the French army. They were the veterans of veterans, men who had fought in dozens of battles, who had marched from Madrid to Moscow and back. They wore distinctive uniforms, received extra pay, and were commanded by the best officers. Napoleon reserved them for the critical moment of a battle, the final blow that would destroy an already weakened enemy. It was said that the Imperial Guard had never failed in a charge, never retreated. Their mere presence on the battlefield could shake enemy morale. Around 7 in the evening, with the sun beginning to set, Napoleon ordered the Imperial Guard to advance. He formed them personally, addressing these men who had followed him through glory and disaster. About 5,000 men of the Middle and Old Guard advanced in several columns toward the center of Wellington's lines. Napoleon accompanied them part of the way, then handed them over to the command of Ney, who, despite his previous mistakes, remained one of the bravest leaders of men in Europe. The Guard advanced with mechanical precision, climbing the slope through the smoke and chaos. They marched to the beat of drums, unfazed by the artillery fire that began to fall upon them. They passed French soldiers exhausted from previous attacks, and their arrival brought new hope to the army. The Guard was attacking. The Guard would win. This was what always happened. French soldiers began to rise to follow the Guard, preparing to exploit the breakthrough that was sure to come. Wellington saw the Guard approaching. He recognized the danger. If the Guard broke his line, if they created a breach, his entire position could collapse. But he had prepared a surprise. He had kept some of his best troops in reserve, hidden behind the ridge, untouched by the previous attacks. These were the British Guards, Britain's elite infantry, and the 52nd Division, including hardened veterans of the Peninsula Wars. The French Imperial Guard surged up the slope and reached the top of the ridge. Through the smoke and low evening light, they must have thought they were about to sweep away the weakened opposition. And then Wellington spoke the famous words, "Now, Maitland, now is your time." The British Guards, who had been lying in cover behind the ridge, rose to their feet. Over 1,000 muskets were aimed at the Imperial Guard from a distance of perhaps 40 yards. What happened next lasted only a few minutes, but it changed the course of history. The British rained volley after volley on the Imperial Guard. At such close range, with targets so tightly packed, it was impossible to miss. The front ranks of the Guard were simply wiped out. Men fell in huge numbers, their beautiful, proud formations shattered by the weight of the fire. They tried to return fire, but they were in column. Only a fraction of them could use their weapons, and they were being slaughtered by a line that could bring almost all its men to bear. The Imperial Guard wavered. For the first time in its famous history, the Guard hesitated, and then Wellington ordered a bayonet charge. The British Guards, shouting, advanced with fixed bayonets. Elsewhere along the line, other British and Allied units joined the attack. The Imperial Guard unthinkably began to retreat. They didn't break into panicked flight. They retreated fighting, but they were retreating. The impossible had happened. The Guard was being defeated. The news spread across the battlefield like wildfire. La Garde recule. The Guard is retreating. For the French army, which had endured a day of carnage, which was holding on by sheer faith in its emperor and the invincibility of its Guard, it was psychologically devastating. If the Guard could be defeated, then all was lost. Panic began to spread. Units that had held firm all day suddenly broke. What had been an organized army began to fall apart into a fleeing mob. Wellington saw the moment. He rode to the front of his lines and waved his hat, the signal for a general advance. The entire Allied line began to advance. 68,000 men, who had defended that ridge for hours of hell, now attacked. The French, exhausted, demoralized, their elite crushed, and their flank threatened by the Prussians, broke. The retreat became a rout. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. Entire units fell apart. The road south became a chaotic mass of fleeing men, vehicles, abandoned cannons, and wounded. Only the Old Guard, the most veteran of the Imperial Guard, maintained any order. They formed squares and slowly retreated. covering the army's escape. When called to surrender, General Cambronne allegedly responded with a single obscene word that would become legendary. They fought to the end, selling their lives to give the emperor a chance to escape. It was a final display of loyalty and courage that could not change the outcome, but it added another layer of tragedy to the disaster. The Prussians, now arriving in full force, joined the pursuit. Where the battle-weary British pursued only a short distance before stopping to regroup, the Prussians continued relentlessly through the night. They had promised Wellington they would pursue the French to destruction, and they kept that promise. For miles they hunted the fleeing French, giving little mercy, capturing thousands. Napoleon left the battlefield sometime during the rout. His dream had ended not in a glorious explosion, but in a miserable flight through the night. The man who had been called the greatest military genius of his age had been utterly defeated. The army he had led that morning, 72,000 strong, had been destroyed. Some 25,000 were dead or wounded, 15,000 captured, the rest scattered. It was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Allied losses were also terrible. Wellington had lost about 15,000 men, killed or wounded. The Prussians had lost about 7,000. The battlefield was a nightmare of bodies, wounded screaming for help, and dying horses. The small village of Waterloo, which gave its name to the battle, was transformed into a giant hospital, with wounded filling every building. The water in the stream that ran through the battlefield was red with blood. Wellington, when he saw the extent of the casualties among his officers and men, many of whom he knew personally, wept. He famously said, "Nothing except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won." He had won the most important victory of his career, but the cost in the lives of good men was crushing. Wellington would never fight another battle in his long life. But what was the secret weapon that truly destroyed Napoleon? It wasn't a single thing, but an integrated system of tactical and technical superiority. It was the British two-line formation with its devastating firepower against attacking columns. It was superior training and discipline that allowed British soldiers to deliver controlled fire under the most terrifying conditions. It was the clever use of terrain to shield troops from artillery fire. It was the rifles that disrupted and disorganized French formations. It was the calm, professional leadership of officers who held men to their positions when every instinct screamed to run. More fundamentally, it was a philosophical difference in how armies were organized and trained. The French army, for all its tactical brilliance and the bravery of its soldiers, relied largely on mass column-based attacks that relied on momentum and shock. It worked wonderfully against armies that fought in the same manner, or against opponents whose fire was sufficiently weak or poorly coordinated that the attack could close before being stopped. But against a force that had specifically developed tactics to defeat this method, and that could deliver massive and accurate fire at close range, and that had the discipline to hold its ground under pressure, the French method failed. The secret weapon was essentially the British military revolution in infantry training, a revolution that had been developing for decades, honed in the fighting in India and the Iberian Peninsula. The British had understood that in the age of the flintlock musket, the side that could deliver more accurate shots in a shorter period of time would win infantry battles, and they had built a system of training, tactics, and doctrine around this principle. Napoleon, for all his genius, had failed to adapt adequately. He had won so many battles using his tried-and-true methods that he failed to recognize when facing an opponent who had found the countermeasure. His tactics had destroyed the Austrians at Austerlitz, the Prussians at Jena, the Russians at Friedland. But Wellington was not Austrian, Prussian, or Russian. He had studied Napoleonic methods, fought them for years, and developed the tools to defeat them. There was also the factor of alliance. Napoleon was fighting alone, while Wellington had the promise of Prussian support. Blucher's determination to keep his word and march to the sound of the cannons, even with his army tired and himself wounded, was crucial. Without the Prussians, Wellington might not have chosen to fight at Waterloo. And even if he had, the outcome might have been different. The Prussian threat forced Napoleon to divide his forces, sending Grouchy on a wild goose chase and then diverting precious troops to contain the Prussians at Plancenoit. This diluted his attacks against Wellington and ensured that he could not concentrate his entire force against a single enemy. There's also a case to be made for the human factor. Napoleon wasn't at his best at Waterloo. He was ill, possibly suffering from hemorrhoids or some other illness that made riding difficult. He was tired. The strain of years of war, the trauma of the Russian campaign, the weight of carrying the fate of his nation on his shoulders. He made errors of judgment that the younger, more vigorous Napoleon of Austerlitz probably wouldn't have made. He gave crucial commands to subordinates like Ney, who failed to carry out his intentions properly. The Napoleon of 1805 would have personally overseen every crucial phase of the battle. The Napoleon of 1815 was more distant, less engaged in the critical details, but we shouldn't take credit away from Wellington. He fought a brilliant defensive battle. Every decision he made, from choosing the terrain to positioning his troops, from timing his countercharges to maintaining his reserves, was near perfect. He knew his troops' strengths and weaknesses. He positioned his weaker units where they would be least likely to face the worst pressure, and his stronger units where they were most needed. He remained calm under immense pressure, riding along his lines during the battle's most critical moments, being seen by his troops and giving them confidence by his mere presence. The consequences of Waterloo were profound and lasting. Napoleon abdicated again 4 days later on June 22nd. This time there was no turning back. He surrendered to the British, expecting to be treated as a high-ranking prisoner of war, perhaps exiled to England or America. Instead, the British sent him to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from anywhere. There, he would spend the last 6 years of his life, dictating his memoirs, quarreling with his British guardians, slowly wasting away. He died in 1821, aged just 51, still imprisoned on his island prison. Waterloo ended the Napoleonic Wars, a quarter-century of nearly continuous conflict that had transformed Europe. The victorious powers established what became known as the Concert of Europe, a system of international diplomacy designed to prevent any one nation from dominating again. It worked remarkably well. There would not be another general European war until the Crimean War in 1853, and there would not be another conflict involving all the great powers until World War I in 1914. Waterloo ushered in the longest period of relative peace Europe had known in centuries. The changes Napoleon had brought to Europe were not fully reversed. Though the victors tried, the Congress of Vienna restored many of the old monarchies, but they could not completely erase the ideas of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, the concepts of national rights, popular sovereignty, and meritocratic rather than aristocratic government. All these ideas had been planted and would continue to grow. The revolutions of 1830 and 1848, the Italian and German unification movements, all had their roots in the era Napoleon had started. Militarily, the lessons of Waterloo have been studied for generations. The importance of infantry firepower, the need for coordination between different combat arms, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, were all analyzed in military academies around the world. But perhaps the most important lesson was one that many generals failed to learn, that past success does not guarantee future victory, that tactics must evolve to meet new challenges, and that adaptability is as important as tradition. Warfare itself was changing. Waterloo was one of the last battles of the era of line and column warfare, where armies faced each other on open fields in dense formations. The following decades would see the arrival of the breech-loading rifle, recoil-controlled artillery, the machine gun, barbed wire, and eventually the tank and the airplane. Each innovation would change the nature of warfare, but at a fundamental level, the lessons remained the same: training, discipline, leadership, and adaptability. These have always been, and always will be, the true secret weapons of victorious armies. For the ordinary men who fought at Waterloo, the battle was simply a day of unspeakable terror, whether they survived or not. Many veterans would spend the rest of their lives dealing with the trauma of what they had experienced. In an era before post-traumatic stress disorder was recognized, these men were simply expected to move on with their lives. Some did. Others were destroyed by their memories, ending their lives in poverty, alcoholism, or suicide. The wounded faced particularly horrific fates. Medicine in the early 1800s was primitive. General anesthesia didn't exist. Surgery was performed with the patient awake, screaming in pain. Amputation was the standard treatment for most serious limb injuries, performed with ordinary saws, without sterilization, with the patient held down by strong men. Infection killed most of the seriously injured. Those who survived were often permanently crippled, left to beg on the streets because there were no adequate government pensions or social safety nets. The battlefield after the fighting was the scene of horrors we can hardly imagine today. Looters, both soldiers and local civilians, roamed among the dead and dying, stripping bodies of everything of value: clothes, boots, teeth that could be used for false teeth. There were stories of men still alive being stripped naked and left to die of exposure. The dead were eventually gathered and burned or buried in mass graves. Years later, the bones were dug up and ground for fertilizer, a grotesque fate for men who had fought bravely for their nations. The small village of Waterloo became a tourist destination almost immediately. In the months and years after the battle, thousands of visitors came to see the field where history had been made. They walked the grounds collecting souvenirs, musket balls, buttons, and fragments of equipment. Local entrepreneurs established museums filled with artifacts from the battle. Wellington himself visited the battlefield years later and was disturbed by how it had been transformed into a spectacle, the ground altered by the construction of a large earthen mound, the Lion's Mound, built to mark the spot where the Prince of Orange had been wounded. Reputations were made and destroyed by Waterloo. Wellington became a national hero in Britain, eventually serving as prime minister. Blücher was celebrated in Prussia as the liberator of Germany. Ney was convicted of treason by the restored Bourbon government and executed by firing squad, a tragic end for one of France's bravest soldiers. Other of Napoleon's marshals quietly retired or fled into exile. Grouchy, whose failure to prevent the Prussians from reaching Waterloo was crucial, spent the rest of his life arguing that he had followed his orders correctly and was not to blame for the defeat. Napoleon himself on St. Helena rewrote history in his memoirs. He blamed his subordinates, particularly Ney and Grouchy. He argued that if he had been in better health, if his marshals had carried out his orders properly, if it had not rained the night before and delayed his attack, he would have won. He never truly accepted that he had been outmatched by Wellington, that his tactics had been countered, that his enemy had simply been better that day. To the end, he remained convinced of his own genius, unable to accept that even geniuses can be defeated. There is something deeply human in his refusal to accept ultimate responsibility for defeat. It is easier to blame others, to blame bad luck, to blame circumstances beyond one's control, than to look in the mirror and admit personal failure. But history is clearer. Napoleon made tactical and strategic errors at Waterloo. He underestimated his opponent. He failed to adapt to the tactical realities he faced. He divided his forces inappropriately. He gave critical commands to subordinates who underperformed. And above all, he faced a military system, the British system of infantry training and tactics, that was, in crucial respects, superior to his own. The secret weapon in the end was simply better preparation, better training, a better understanding of the tactical realities of musket warfare. It wasn't magic. It wasn't some mysterious technology. It was hard work, attention to detail, a refusal to accept the status quo, a willingness to innovate and experiment. The British had spent years developing their tactics, testing them in combat, refining them. They had built a system that transformed ordinary soldiers into extraordinarily effective fighters. And on June 18, 1815, this system proved its worth in the most dramatic way possible. Waterloo teaches us that in war, as in life, there is no substitute for preparation, training, and a willingness to learn and adapt. It teaches us that arrogance, the assumption of superiority based on past successes, can be fatal. It teaches us that sometimes the decisive advantage comes not from having more troops or better weapons, but from using what you have more effectively than your opponent. It teaches us that leadership matters, that decisions made by individuals at crucial moments can change the course of history. More broadly, Waterloo reminds us of the terrible cost of war. More than 40,000 men were killed or wounded that single day. 40,000 families destroyed. 40,000 lives ended or permanently altered. And for what? So that one man could keep his throne. So that ancient monarchies could be restored. So that the map of Europe could be drawn one way rather than another. As we look back from our privileged position in the 21st century, it is difficult to avoid a sense of tragic waste. But we must also remember that for those who lived through that period, these were not abstractions. For the French, Napoleon represented the revolution, the principle that talent and merit should triumph over birth and privilege. For his opponents, he represented tyranny, aggressive conquest, the disruption of legitimate order. Both sides believed they were fighting for important principles, for ways of life, for their countries and their values. The soldiers who marched to their deaths at Waterloo were doing so not simply because they were ordered to, but because they believed in something greater than themselves. This belief, this willingness to risk everything for a cause, is at once the noblest and most tragic aspect of human nature. It is what allows us to achieve great feats of courage and self-sacrifice. It is also what allows us to inflict terrible tragedies on one another. Waterloo was both a triumph of the human spirit and proof of our potential for destruction. The men who fought there displayed extraordinary courage, enduring hours of terror that would break most modern people in minutes. But it was courage in the service of a system, the Napoleonic Wars, that killed millions across Europe for over 20 years. As we reach the end of this long journey through one of the most important days in European history, it's worth thinking about what really happened on that muddy field in Belgium in June 1815. An era ended. Napoleon's dream of a unified European empire under French leadership died. The idea that military genius and boldness could conquer all was challenged. The superiority of new forms of military organization and tactics over older methods was demonstrated, and tens of thousands of men paid with their lives to teach these lessons to the world. The secret weapon that destroyed Napoleon's empire wasn't hidden. It was in plain sight. It was the training of a British soldier who spent hours on the firing range practicing with his musket. It was the discipline of a sergeant who kept men in line when instinct screamed to run. It was the tactical skill of a general who understood how to use terrain to protect his troops. It was the determination of an ally who marched through exhaustion to keep a promise. It was the combination of all these things, an integrated system of military excellence that proved superior to the methods that had conquered Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte died on St. Helena in 1821. His last words were supposedly, "France, Army, Head of the Army, Josephine." In his mind, he was back in his glory days, commanding his troops to victory, loved by his first wife. The reality was a middle-aged man, sick, dying on a remote island, his empire lost, his family scattered, his dream in ruins. It's impossible not to feel some sadness at such a sad end for someone who had risen so high. But we must also remember the cost of his ambitions. It is estimated that between 3 and 6 million people died in the Napoleonic Wars, soldiers and civilians alike, from battles, disease, famine, and the general disruption of society that war brings. Spain was devastated. Germany was torn apart by years of conflict. Russia suffered terribly during the invasion of 1812, and France itself, which Napoleon claimed to be serving, was invaded twice, occupied, forced to pay massive payments, and reduced from a great power to a second-rate state for decades. Was it all for nothing? Not entirely. The legal reforms Napoleon introduced, embodied in the Napoleonic Code, have survived and influenced legal systems around the world to this day. The ideas of merit over privilege, of rational rather than arbitrary government, of national rights, all of these flourished in the 1800s, in part because of the Napoleonic period. Europe itself was shaken from medieval structures and forced to modernize. So perhaps Napoleon's legacy is not only war and destruction, but also some progress toward more modern forms of society and government. Waterloo remains one of the most studied and most mythical events in military history. Entire libraries have been written about that single day. Every decision, every troop movement, every cavalry charge, every musket volley has been analyzed and reanalyzed. Historians still debate what might have happened if Napoleon had attacked sooner, if Ney had not wasted the cavalry, if Grouchy had arrived in time, if the Prussians had been delayed for a few more hours. These are fascinating questions, but in the end, they are only guessing. What we know for sure is what really happened, and what happened changed the world. For the soldiers who were there, who survived that bloody Sunday, Waterloo was simply the most terrifying day of their lives. Many never spoke of it, keeping the horrible memories to themselves. Others told and retold their stories, dealing with the trauma through repeated telling. Some turned to alcohol, trying to drown the memories. Others found strength in their survival, living their lives with a renewed appreciation for each day they were given. It's easy when studying military history to focus on big strategies, the movements of armies, the decisions of generals. But we must never forget that wars are fought by individual people, each with their own fears, hopes, and dreams. Each of the more than 40,000 casualties at Waterloo was a person, a son who would never return to his mother, a father who would never see his children grow up, a husband who left a widow, a young man whose life was cut short before it could truly begin. Each of them mattered. Each of them was unique. Each of them left a hole somewhere when they died. The ultimate lesson of Waterloo may not be about military tactics or strategy. Perhaps it's about the fragility of human life and the terrible cost of human ambition. Napoleon wanted glory. He wanted power. He wanted to leave his mark on history. He achieved all of this, but at what cost? Millions dead, a devastated continent, his own miserable end on a prison island. Was it truly a price worth paying? These are questions every generation must ask itself. As we look at today's world, with its own conflicts and tensions, it's worth remembering the lessons of Waterloo. War always has a cost. Victory is always bought with blood. And sometimes the pursuit of glory and power leads only to destruction and sorrow. Waterloo was a necessary battle, a battle that had to be fought to end Napoleonic rule. But it was also a tragedy, a waste of lives on an almost unimaginable scale. As we conclude this amazing journey through one of the bloodiest and most decisive days in European history, we remember not only the generals and their strategies, not only the secret weapon that changed the course of the battle, but the tens of thousands of ordinary men who faced unimaginable terror and did what was asked of them. Some showed courage beyond understanding. Others simply survived. All deserve to be remembered. The story of Waterloo is one of courage and fear, of genius and error, of victory and defeat. It is a story that reminds us of both the best and the worst of humanity. It is a story that more than 200 years later still has lessons to teach us about leadership, about preparedness, about the importance of adapting to new realities. And above all, it is a story that reminds us of the precious value of every human life. and the terrible cost when we choose to resolve our differences through violence. May we learn from Waterloo. May we honor those who fell on that distant field. And may we work to build a world where such sacrifices are no longer necessary. May the Lord God in His infinite mercy bless those souls who died on that terrible day, soldiers of all nations who fought bravely and paid the ultimate price. May He grant comfort to their descendants and to all of us the wisdom to value peace and learn from the painful lessons of history. May we always remember that every life is precious in the eyes of the Creator, and the true greatness lies not in conquest by the sword, but in building a more just and peaceful world for all future generations.